Hey, have you signed up with BLUNET yet? No? Well, let's fix that.
Head over to www.bluenet.co.nz and hit Join Us today. All you need to do is fill in your name, date of birth, phone number, and a few other details. This helps us get you set up faster. We'll also need a photo of your ONT serial number and your modem. Not sure what an ONT is? Don't worry, this is what it looks like, and every house with internet has one. And make sure you have a valid ID and a utility bill or government letter to confirm your address.
When you join BLUNET, you're not just getting fast, stable internet. You're also supporting shows like Tautuana, Breaking Waves, and Sports Salanoa. Your BLUNET subscription helps us bring you more content.
If you sign up this month, you get $10 off your first 3 months. If you have any questions, call 0800 258 638. Join BLUNET today.
Oi, go!
Come with me. This is where our adventure begins. You call it paradise, we call it home. This is Samoa.
Malo labele soifua, malilangi mama, fatalo faatu. Kia ora. Welcome back to the second episode of Breaking Waves. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our audience, our Bluwave TV audience, for supporting our podcast, Breaking Waves, Sports Talanoa, and Tautuana. Thank you so much for your contributions. If there is one thing that I can ask of anyone watching today is to like, follow, and subscribe to our content on YouTube and Facebook. This small gesture really helps us here at our business to keep the lights on. So please like, follow, and subscribe to our channels. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Bluwave TV. Thank you, Bluwave TV. This is the engine room of our podcast. Without it, we would not be able to film and do all the amazing things that we do here and create all the content that we love doing every day. Thank you, Bluwave TV. Another special shout out to Eveni Pacific. Thank you, Eveni, household brand. Everyone knows Eveni Pacific. If you are looking for cultural wear, Samoan men and women's and children's, please visit 1 John Golter Drive, Auckland Airport. You'll be able to find a wide selection of clothes there, which you can buy for yourself or gift to family or friends. Thank you, Eveni Pacific, for supporting us and for sponsoring us here at Breaking Waves at Bluwave TV. I'd also like to shout out to our new sponsor, Samoa Tourism. Thank you, Samoa Tourism, for contributing to our work here at Bluwave TV and sponsoring us. We're really grateful. For anyone watching, please check out their website and see the cool work that they're doing in Samoa and across the world. I have been so busy the last 2 weeks. It's been pretty full on, and about a week and a half ago, I attended a Pacifica and Māori Leadership Summit, which I enjoyed attending. I had the opportunity to connect with Māori business owners and hearing how they're developing the Māori economy, the types of challenges that they're facing, and how they managed to find solutions for it. One of the key messages that really stuck out to me personally was cultural values shouldn't sit alongside business strategy, but they should guide it. Decision making should be grounded in long-term outcomes, not just short-term wins. And this really resonated with me. There was also strong conversations about systems, how Māori and Pacifica people could work together in real practical ways. This event had multiple panels, and throughout the day, I was particularly looking forward to Carmel Sepuloni, Labour MP, and also Huhana Linden from the Green Party, who were given the opportunity to speak at this event. It just felt like the right room for me to raise these questions about the Pacific Business Trust, something I've been very vocal about in my last episode, and in front of people who are involved in business. And these are the people who are directly impacted by the funding decisions of the Ministry for Pacific Peoples and the Pacific Business Trust. The question I asked Carmel and Huhana, before I asked, I acknowledged in the room that it's a privilege for us to be in that space because many in our communities don't usually have that access to these spaces or aren't necessarily afforded with the same opportunities. I shared that the Pacific Business Trust receives a significant amount of public funding for Pacific economic development, but from my experience, their financial reporting focused on outputs, not outcomes. Reporting on outputs means that an organization can receive $6-7 million a year, say they've done how many workshops here, they've conducted how many events here, did how many visitations here. However, it doesn't really have to report on how that money is creating real outcome or changes. Outcomes looks like increase in Pacific business ownership rates over time, growth in average income or profit levels of supported businesses, number of businesses that scale beyond startup into sustainable outcomes. And the truth is, the reality based on data, Pacific business ownership has sat at around 1.9% for over a decade. It hasn't shifted. So I asked Carmel and Huhana, when millions are being spent over decades without clear accountability for outcomes, how do we work collaboratively, politicians, businesses, governance, to ensure that investment actually leads to real, measurable change for Pacific people? In my mind, we can't keep throwing money at the same institutions who have no data on how this has actually collectively improved our Pacifica business community. Honourable Carmel responded by saying that the trust reports on outputs, that it's a Crown entity, and acknowledged the email I had sent Shane Reti. A lot of people in the room laughed at this, and she asked if I had raised these issues with the trust. I said yes, and I haven't received a formal response, and that it was disheartening how hard it is to get clear answers from a tax-funded entity. She acknowledged it, and then she said, well, the trust does do some good work. They do some good work. I appreciate her response, but to be honest, it didn't really answer my question. Huhana, however, who was a wahine Māori, she said, oia them. Keep asking questions, keep pushing, no fluff, just clarity. And I really respected that. But what really struck me about this moment was that directly after I asked my question, this room with about 200 people in attendance from different regions all across New Zealand, my question was met with a huge round of applause. It was actually the only question that entire day that received that amount of applause. To be honest, I didn't share this to talk myself up. For me, it was an indicator that many people in the room are aware that the situation with the Pacific Business Trust and supported the hard questions being asked to politicians. I still stand strongly in my belief that we need to move from funding strategies with unmeasurable outcomes to demanding real, accountable impact for our people. And I think it's time. There's so many of us. There's so much talent, thriving Pacifica talent for that time. Another event I attended was the Pacifica Rugby Sports Hall of Fame. It was such a great night. The food was so amazing. There was only 3 of us on the table, but they brought like 8 plates because they were like missing. So we had 4 extra plates. Extra food always makes me happy. The music, great. I had so much fun with our team. It was really special for me to see so many people from our Pacific community come together to celebrate success and honor those who've contributed so much to the game. There was a real sense of pride in the room. We even got to briefly catch up with the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, with our host there, Asiata, and also our lawyer, Ati Nae, Asiata as well. And we had a laugh. We talked about his trip to Samoa and his new Matai title. And Christopher Luxon said Samoa was a trip that he will never forget. Pacific Business Trust was also a sponsor for this event. Good to see their money going to these big fancy dinners while turning away small business owners. But thank you, PBT, for contributing to this event. On my last episode, if you haven't seen it, please go check that out. I dived into my personal experience with the trust, how I was treated by their CEO, and just the unprofessionalism I faced. I also went into the Ministry for Pacific Peoples and how they were okay with the business trust's conduct and how Pacific cultural values are just being used as a banner, but when it comes time to applying it, that seems to just go out the window. I also briefly covered a ruling from the Employment Relations Authority involving John Faitala and Vahanovea against the Pacific Business Trust, where the trust was ordered to pay $50,000 after their dismissals were found to be unjustified. The decision was then appealed to the Employment Court of New Zealand, and a new ruling came out literally just 3 weeks ago, and I've gone through the full case. I literally have gone through the full case, and in today's episode I'm going to break down what actually happened. On the 19th of March 2026, just 3 weeks ago, a court ruling was issued in the case involving former Pacific Business Trust employees Vahanovea and John Faitala. This followed a challenge to a decision made by the Employment Relations Authority, the ERA, and it put the spotlight back on how these employees were treated throughout their dismissal. I already covered this in my previous episode. The authority found that the dismissals were unjustified. What I also shared was, based on reporting from Pacific Media Network, was the human impact, the emotional toll, the reality of what they described as being treated as garbage, as rubbish, throughout their employment. But here's why the next stage matters. The authority awarded remedies. John Faitala received 1 month's worth of wages, $1,000 in lost benefits, and $25,000 for distress. Vahanoa received 2 months of wages, $1,000 in benefits, and $25,000 for distress. That's just over $50,000 combined. But this is the key point. The authority did not uphold their claims for unjustified disadvantage, breaches of their employment agreement, or penalties for breaches of good faith. So this appeal isn't about whether they were dismissed unfairly. That's already been proven. This is about what came with that dismissal. Just to clarify the differences. The employees are now challenging why their disadvantage claims were rejected, why no penalties were imposed, and whether the compensation was actually enough. So the case was then moved to the Employment Court of New Zealand. For those of us who aren't too familiar with these systems, the Employment Relations Authority is where disputes within workplaces are first investigated in a more informal fact-based setting. The Employment Court is a higher level court where the ERA decisions are challenged through a more formal legal process. So what we're seeing now is a shift from fact-finding to legal scrutiny. And this was the Pacific Business Trust's position. They argued that the ERA got it right, that everything should have been treated as one issue, not a separate issue. Compensation was already high enough. No penalty should apply. And the ruling was fair. If anything, the plaintiffs, John and Vahanoa, were already given more than they should have been. But let's look into what actually happened and the evidence that was presented in court. In this case, both parties were given the opportunity to present fresh evidence focused on the key issues under dispute. Plaintiffs, John and Vahanoa, provided that the Pacific Business Trust is a long-standing, not-for-profit organization. Its stated purpose is to support Pacifica people to thrive in business and employment by growing innovation, developing talent and leadership, and improving the overall capability and prosperity of Pacifica businesses. The trust also positions itself as a trusted partner of Pacifica communities. It was appointed as an economic development agency in 2021, but says it was unable to implement the operational changes required for that role due to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. John Faitala was employed at the Pacific Business Trust in 2020, and by 2023, he held the role of General Manager for Program Services and Clients. Vahanoa joined the trust earlier than John in 2018 and served as a Corporate Services Manager. Evidence presented in court outlined the scope of both of their roles and their responsibilities, and a very important part that was revealed in their employment agreement included embedding Pacifica values, cultural values, into the workplace, particularly within employment, relationships, and organizational practice. Here is the key information presented in their contract. Education and qualifications. It is desired that the successful applicant is fluent in one Pacific language and or have cultural capability and understanding. Values alignment, respect, the foundational cornerstone of Pacifica culture to treat all people irrespective of who they are equally and with the same level of respect we expect of ourselves. Family and community. Ainga is central to Pacific values, brings a sense of identity and ancestry to bring people together. Reciprocity, a duty to meet mutual needs in the community, and an obligation of care between members of these communities. Religion and spirituality. The church is a centerpiece in Pacific communities and is a key piece of traditional value. The Pacific Business Trust accepted this evidence, and they said that these values are the 5 pillars of the Pacifica community and that they are intrinsically embedded in Pacifica individuals. John and Vahanoa also confirmed, yep, these are the values that are deeply ingrained in who they are as people. It shapes the way that they conduct themselves and interact with others. So I think it's good that there's a mutual agreement on, establishing what these Pacifica values mean. And I won't lie, I was pretty impressed by this, the fact that cultural values are explicitly embedded into the employment contracts It's powerful because it's not just symbolic anymore. You know, it's a formal commitment, and to see that translated into something as structured or as enforceable as a contract, that's really good, because it moves from culture just being talked about to now something that we need to expect and uphold. Vahanoa spoke about the importance of respect and dignity and the expectation that respect is always reciprocated. She explained how this shaped the way that she conducted herself in the workplace, and saying that as Tongans, there is a deep cultural respect for employers. You know, you don't just complain loudly or argue in front of people openly, because that can be seen as disrespectful. And she made it very clear this is the standard she held herself to during her time at the trust. John supported what Vahanoa said. He reinforced that these are not just individual views, but shared Pacifica values. He spoke about the principle of treating others the way you want to be treated, and he said this was the way he conducted himself within his interactions at his time at the trust. I personally have met John Faitala a few times, and I never, even though he had a top position as the general manager, I never felt like he was trying to be elitist or better than me, or because he has a higher position. I never felt that from John. I never got those vibes from him. He always just checked up if everything is okay with the business and if our relationship with the trust was flowing well. But anyways, back to the facts. In early 2023, a new CEO was appointed, Mary Lose. And before undertaking this role and the reset, Mary says that she was facing a running number of challenges and she was looking for ways it could respond. From March on the same year, the trust was receiving ongoing employment relations advice from an external provider regarding its restructuring and redundancy process. On the 24th of May, the trust invited staff to attend an in-person presentation, and it was delivered regarding the reset and the restructure. And after the presentation, Mary Lose met with affected staff members, including John and Vahanoa, and they were both handed a letter alongside a proposal document stating that the trust was considering a restructure due to strategic expansion and transitioning into an economic development agency. But before we get into more details, we're going to go into a quick break. We'll be right back.
Hey, have you signed up with BLUNET yet? No? Well, let's fix that.
Head over to www.blunet.co.nz and hit join us today. All you need to do is fill in your name, date of birth, phone number, and a few other details. This helps us get you set up faster. We'll also need a photo of your ONT serial number and your modem. Not sure what an ONT is? Don't worry, this is what it looks like, and every house with internet has one. And make sure you have a valid ID and a utility bill or government letter to confirm your address.
When you join BLUNET, you're not just getting fast, stable internet. You're also supporting shows like Tautuana, Breaking Waves, and Sports Salanoa. Your BLUNET subscription helps us bring you more content.
If you sign up this month, you get $10 off your first 3 months. If you have any questions, call 0800 258 638. Join BLUNET today.
Shadows grow, memories
Go!
Come with me. This is where our adventure begins. You call it paradise, we call it home. This is Samoa.
Welcome back. After CEO Mary Lose gives her presentation about the restructure, both John and Vahanoa were later invited to a meeting on the 1st of June 2023 to discuss a proposed restructure, and they were given the option to bring a support person. The proposal outlined several key issues the trust said it needed to address, including financial pressure, failure to meet delivery expectation to funders, non-compliance with targets, and concerns that some roles are proposed to be created. However, hope was given to Vahanoa and John that they could be redeployed into other roles. On the 29th of May 2023, John emailed Ms. Lose providing feedback on the proposed restructure. He asked a number of questions, including what process would be followed, how staff would be supported, requesting further information such as an external report, which he believed conflicted with the data provided by the trust. And John stated that he requested the information with a reasonable time to give feedback. Vahanoa on the 30th of May emailed Mary Lose asking for more clarity on the proposed restructure, including more time to respond, how her role was being assessed, and whether there were real opportunities for her to move into a new position. What's important here is that Vahanoa was open. She actually expressed that she was looking forward to the improvements and she wanted to be a part of this shift. Mary Lose responded the next day, provided a proposed organizational chart and referencing the possibility of redeployment, but noted that more detail would come after the initial consultation meeting that was scheduled for the 1st of June. Separate meetings were then held with both Vahanoa and John by Tala on that day. However, there's no clear record of what was discussed in those meetings What we do know is what happened after those meetings. So both were emailed and asked to provide further feedback on the proposal by the 6th of June, giving them just a short window to respond. When it came time to respond, both John and Vahanoa raised some pretty serious concern. John Faitala described the process as very stressful and challenging. He said that saying it felt more like a tick box exercise and not a genuine consultation. He pointed out the information provided was incomplete and said there wasn't enough detail for him to give meaningful feedback. He also reiterated that several of his earlier questions had still not been answered. Vahanoa raised concerns about the timeframes. She questioned whether the process allowed sufficient time for proper consideration, and she also sought clarity on where key functions like human resources and administration would sit within the proposed structure. And as I'm reading over this, in consultation processes, timing really matters. If employees are being asked to give feedback, they need to be given enough information to do that properly and enough time to think about it. Shortly after, on the 8th of June, Mary Lose emailed Vahanoa with a list of the newly proposed roles, asking her to indicate an interest by the 12th of June 2023. And the same deadline was also given to John. When that date arrived, Mary followed up with Vahanoa to confirm if she still wanted to apply to any of the new roles. Vahanoa responded literally minutes later, and she said, yes, there's 2 positions that I'm interested in, and that's the strategic relationships and the customer experience. On the 16th of June, both John and Vahanoa then met separately with Mary Lose. In John's case, the meeting was recorded with Mary's permission, and the court later accepted that recording as a reliable account of what was discussed. Very important lesson, guys. If you feel unsafe in your workspace, record your meetings. It could come in handy later. During that meeting, John explained that he hadn't expressed interest to any of the new roles because he felt he hadn't been given enough information about the restructure and that his earlier questions remained unresolved. Mary responded by apologizing. She said the questions John had raised were not considered relevant to his role and explained that the trust had relied on a capability matrix. She also stated that an external report John had referred to did not inform the proposed changes, and John acknowledged that a restructure may have been necessary, but emphasized that he wanted to understand the context behind it. Mary then encouraged him to consider 2 alternative roles, noting that his position as general manager will be disestablished. And she also told John that she would review his earlier feedback and respond to him in writing. This is a commitment that she repeated multiple times during this meeting. John also asked what support is available. Again, the same question Vahanoa asked during this process. And in response, Mary said that there was no employment assistance program in place, but she was looking into introducing one. In my opinion, honestly, it's absolutely reasonable for a general manager to ask for context in a situation like this. At that level, you're not just executing decisions, you're responsible for strategy, leadership, and alignment. If the direction of the organization is shifting, it's not only appropriate, it's expected that a GM do that, to want to understand where things are going and whether they align with that direction. That is basic professionalism. Asking questions, seeking clarity, and wanting to make informed decisions, especially during a restructure. It's not resistance, it's due diligence. It's what you would expect from someone in a senior leadership role. I've always believed in that quote, leaders who refuse questions are usually hiding answers. Another one I like is, if a leader cannot explain their decisions, they shouldn't be the ones making them. Mary acknowledged that she was meant to respond to John's questions, but instead of providing those answers, guess what she did instead? She issued a letter of termination, basically fired them, finalized and emailed to him later that same day. And the same termination letter was also sent to Vahanoa. You have 2 employees asking reasonable professional questions about a restructure that directly affects their livelihoods, They weren't resisting. They weren't being difficult. They were doing exactly what a fair process requires, asking for clarity, asking for time, asking what the options were. And what were they told? They were led to believe that there are many opportunities, that they could be redeployed, and that more information would come at a later date. So John and Vahanoa leaned in, they stayed engaged, probably a bit cautious, but they believed that there was a pathway forward. And the next minute, they're out, fired. That's not just a poor process, that is misleading. That is misleading people. You can't ask for feedback without giving people the full picture. You can't expect meaningful engagement while withholding key information. And you cannot call it fair when the people affected are left uncertain about their own futures. When you are a publicly funded organization that serves Pacific people and operates under the banner of Pacific values, there's an expectation of how you carry yourself. How CEO Mary Losia carried herself in this, I personally believe, does not reflect Pacific values at all. This is what the Employment Relations Authority ruled. The authority accepted that the trust had substantive reasons to support its restructuring of its organization generally. However, it was not satisfied that there was a solid evidentiary foundation to indicate whether the decisions to select the plaintiff's role for redundancy was for genuine commercial reasons. The authority was not satisfied that the trust met its obligation to be constructive and communicative during the process. The trust failed to provide a third-party report which suggested the trust reassess its structure, provide evidence of Ms. Losia's review of the trust's business structure, operations, finances, and funding strategy, provide details of Ms. Losia's mapping of a capability matrix which was carried out weeks prior to the consultation process, respond to the plaintiff's questions and requests for information in a meaningful way, comply with its undertaking at the 16th of June 2023 meeting to respond to Mr. Faitala's feedback and continue to engage in the consultation process after the meeting. Provide evidence that it had followed a selection process and the criteria stated in the 24th of May 2023 letter before informing Ms. Vere that she did not have the requisite skills for the two positions she had applied for, and to raise and consider the possibility of Ms. Vere's redeployment to the CSR role as part of the obligation to be a constructive and communicative employer, and its contractual obligation to consider redeployment options as an alternative to dismissal. The ERA, the Employment Relations Authority, found there was no evidence that the Pacific Business Trust had properly met its obligations under the employment agreements, especially when it came to considering alternatives to dismissal, like redeployment. The authority made it very clear that the issue in this consultation process weren't minor, they were significant. There was no clear evidence that proper consultation had taken place, no indication of employer feedback being taken seriously or genuinely considered, no evidence that either John or Vahanoa were given real information or meaningful opportunities to be redeployed into the trust. Instead, they were fired. So, the ERA established John and Vahanoa's unjustified dismissal grievances, but this is where things take a bit of a turn. It dismissed the unjustified disadvantage grievances. Both of the plaintiffs, John and Vahanoa, argued that there were actually numerous instances of unjustified disadvantage that were separate from dismissal. Examples included breaches of good faith, which amounted to a disadvantage, and the failure to observe Pacifica values when dealing with them. The trust, however, said that there was no error. It was part and parcel of their unjustified dismissal claim, and they said it was the most accurate way to deal with the facts, and it shouldn't be compensated as separate grievances. The trust also acknowledged that it did fall short in regard to applying cultural values in their processes, but also said other aspects of the process exhibited cultural understanding, empathy, talanoa. However, the employment court responded, and they said that the trust breached its duty of good faith by failing to provide the plaintiffs with access to all information relevant to the restructuring process. details of review and a capability matrix, failure to respond to the plaintiff's questions, and the trust failed to comply with the obligation in its employment agreement to consider alternatives. The trust acknowledged that it fell short regarding cultural matters. They tried to say that they applied empathy and tala noa, but the court did not buy it. They didn't find it convincing at all. They said the way that it was handled was the opposite. It was contrary to Pacifica values. It stated, based on the fresh evidence presented at the hearing, that the trust failed to comply with its obligations to adhere Pacifica values during its restructuring process. I'm going to repeat that one. It stated, based on fresh evidence presented at the hearing, that the trust failed to comply with its obligations to adhere to Pacifica values during its restructuring process. This is what I was talking about in my last episode. I'm not blowing hot air everywhere. Now there is a legal document that literally validates that they don't know how to apply Pacific cultural values. Failing to respond to Mr. Faitala, encouraging Ms. Ver to apply to a role only to fire them are clear examples of conduct that do not reflect Pacifica values. And it takes me back to the article, the New Zealand Herald article that I brought up last week, where the former board chair, Paul Retimanu, was so confident that Mary Lawse was the one suitable for the job, and he had so many high hopes for her. Before we go into the next thing, let's go into a break.
Hey, have you signed up with BLUNET yet? No? Well, let's fix that.
Head over to www.blunet.co.nz and hit join us today. All you need to do is fill in your name, date of birth, phone number, and a few other details. This helps us get you set up faster. We'll also need a photo of your ONT serial number and your modem. Not sure what an ONT is? Don't worry, this is what it looks like, and every house with internet has one. And make sure you have a valid ID and a utility bill or government letter to confirm your address.
When you join BLUNET, you're not just getting fast, stable internet. You're also supporting shows like Tautuana, Breaking Waves, and Sports Salanoa. Your BLUNET subscription helps us bring you more content.
If you sign up this month, you get $10 off your first 3 months. If you have any questions, call 0800 258 638. Join BLUNET today. Welcome back. From there, the focus now shifted to remedies. What compensation was actually appropriate for the damage or the hurt that John and Vahanoa experienced? When it came to compensation, both plaintiffs, Vahanoa and John, argued that what they were awarded wasn't enough. They're each seeking up to 12 months worth of lost wages, saying the Employment Relations Authority made an error by limiting compensation and not properly using its discretion to award more than the standard 3 months cap. Now, under New Zealand law, when someone has a personal grievance, the authority can award lost wages, but usually it's kept at 3 months salary. However, there's an important exception. If there's a clear evidence of greater actual loss, the authority has the discretion to award more. In this case, both employees were formally terminated on the 16th of June 2023. They told the authority that their ability to find new work was impacted, particularly because they didn't have a reference from their former employer, but the authority noted that there was no evidence that either of them had actually requested a reference. So based on the evidence in front of it, the authority made its decision. For John, it awarded 1 month's worth of lost wages. That was because he underwent surgery shortly after his dismissal and was unable to work for a period. He then returned to contract work within a few months, and the authority took the view there wasn't enough evidence to support a longer period of financial loss. For Vahanoa, it awarded 2 months of lost wages. This took into account a 4-week payment she had already received when her employment ended, as well as her decision to study and upskill, which the authority considered as part of her efforts to move forward. But this is where the criticism comes in. It was argued that the authority didn't clearly explain how it arrived at those figures, raising questions about whether the compensation truly reflected how the actual loss was experienced. The defendant, PBT, argued, however, the authority was not wrong and that it appropriately weighed the evidence of lost wages, which included the effects of John and Vahanoa to find work, the impact of John Faitala's surgery, and so forth. However, when the Employment Court of New Zealand revisited this part of the case, it looked at the evidence again from the beginning, especially around efforts to find new work. Both John and Vahanoa were questioned on whether they could have secured employment sooner. In John Faitala's case, he gave evidence that he had already been scheduled for major surgery before the restructure even began. He said that even while recovering, he was still actively looking for work. The trust challenged this, suggesting his efforts didn't match what was previously presented, and John stood firm. He backed it up with evidence, and the court accepted that. It found that the earlier conclusion that he hadn't looked for work for 2 months couldn't be sustained. The evidence showed the exact opposite. John kept very detailed records of his job search, applying for both roles in New Zealand and overseas, and working consistently with recruitment agencies, but despite those efforts, he struggled to secure a role at his level. A key issue keeps coming up, and it's the lack of reference from the trust CEO, which recruiters indicated that this would be a major barrier, especially at a senior level. But John didn't stop there. He took steps to improve his position, enrolling in further study, even investing in attending a professional conference overseas so that he could create opportunities. And while he did secure some contract work, his total earnings over 12 months were around $52,000, which is significantly lower than his previous salary of about $170,000. Based on this, the Employment Court of New Zealand did not accept that John Faitala had failed to mitigate his losses, as ruled by the Employment Relations Authority. In other words, it recognized that his inability to find work wasn't due to his lack of effort. So the real question became, how much should he be awarded? And should he be awarded more than the usual 3 months? The Pacific Business Trust argued no. They claimed his job search was limited, that he focused too heavily on contract work within his networks, and importantly, that he disclosed his personal grievances on potential employers, something they say worked against him. That's very interesting. They think the reason why he couldn't get a job was because he told the truth about what happened. To support that, the trust brought in a recruitment expert who argued that not having a formal reference wasn't necessarily a barrier, but being open about a personal grievance could be. Her view was that most employers are cautious about hiring someone who has taken action against a previous employer, and that this kind of information doesn't always need to be disclosed. The court, however, took a very, very different approach. It made it clear that this isn't about a strict legal duty to mitigate. It's about what is reasonable in the circumstance. That means looking at the full context, the individual, the situation, what happened, not just applying a one-size-fits-all expectation. John was raised in Niue, and his culture and his cultural identity is central to who he is as a person. He spoke about carrying core values: integrity, honesty, kindness, fairness, and courage, strong work ethic, not just as ideas, but as the way he lives. So when he was asked by potential employers for a reference from the Pacific Business Trust, he felt he had no choice but to be honest about his situation. In my opinion, this was a strategic decision. This was not a strategic decision. It was a values-based decision. While the trust argued that, some employers may be cautious about hiring someone who has raised personal grievances, the Employment Court of New Zealand was clear on this. He should not be penalized for telling the truth, for being honest. That was my favorite part because it's common sense. Common sense, all these experts. In fact, the court recognized that this approach was entirely consistent with who John was and what his cultural values represented. He was acting in good faith, being transparent, choosing not to mislead anyone. For him, this wasn't about convenience. For John, it was about integrity. And the court found that to be reasonable. Common sense doesn't seem to be common anymore. The trust also argued that by starting his own contracting work, he had distanced himself from the impact of the dismissal, but the court rejected it. It made it clear that he was entitled to pursue contract work as long as he was still actively seeking employment and not turning down real opportunities. That's exactly what he was doing based on the evidence that was presented. Now, turning into Vahanoa's experience, Vahanoa was born and raised in Tonga, and she spoke about how deeply Pasifika values shape who she is as a person, not just personally, but in how she works and how she leads in her own community and in her own family. Before moving to New Zealand, she had already built a career in Tonga. She joined the Pacific Business Trust in 2018 as an executive assistant, and over time progressed into a senior role, eventually becoming a corporate services manager in 2021. It was a position that she carried with pride and one that earned her respect within her community. But after losing her job, everything changed. She had to go to WINS, work in income, work closely with a job broker, updated her CV, and consistently applied for roles across multiple platforms. She also chose to return to study, not as a setback, but as a way to strengthen her chances of re-entering the workforce. The court recognized that these were genuine efforts, and that her loss of income remained directly linked to her dismissal. Despite all of that, she remained unemployed. A key barrier was a lack of reference from her former employer, something recruiters made clear was critical at her level. And like John, she chose to be honest about her situation, including her personal grievance, something that the court said should not be held against her. So what you see here are two people who did everything expected of them. Especially Vahanoa, she upskilled, she applied consistently, she stayed proactive, and she remained honest. And still she was faced with real barriers trying to rebuild her life after that dismissal. When the Employment Court of New Zealand examined the case more closely, it addressed a key argument from the Pacific Business Trust, which claimed that the financial losses experienced by John Faitala and Vahanoa were not caused by the dismissal, but by the choices they made afterward. The court rejected that argument, finding that both individuals acted reasonably and that their decisions did not break the link between their dismissal and the income that they had lost. They also made it clear that general assumptions about employability and unreliable are noting that each situation is different and is not for the court to speculate on why employers may or may not hire someone. The court then turned to the nature of the dismissal itself, accepting that while the restructure may have been justified in principle, the process was not. And in this case, that flawed process directly caused the loss, particularly because the trust failed to properly consider to offer redeployment as required under the employment agreements. It found that if a fair process had been followed, it was more likely than not that the employer should have remained employed through redeployment. When it came to emotional harm, The Employment Court of New Zealand looked closely at the real impact that this had, not just professionally, but personally. Because this kind of harm isn't abstract, it's felt, and often the best people to explain this are the ones who experienced it. In this case, there was strong evidence, not just from John, from his partner, his friends, his members of the community. He's Niuean, his culture is a core part of who he is. He's highly qualified with a bachelor's degree and an MBA, and had built a strong career across government and the private sector before joining the business trust. But more than that, he spoke about how he put his heart and soul into this work. To him, it wasn't just a job. It was about contributing to the economic development of our Pacifica communities. His leadership and commitment were recognized. He was promoted to the general manager. So when the dismissal happened, the impact, it's not just about losing a job. He described the experience as alien, saying that the social and cultural norms he had grown up with as a Pacific person were not reflected in the way he was treated in this organization. He spoke about the hurt, the humiliation, the sense of being dehumanized, and those closest to him saw it too. They spoke about the shame he carried, not just personally, but for his family and community, especially given how sudden and unclear the dismissal appeared. And this is where the court made an important finding. It concluded that the early assessment of compensation did not fully account for the depth of the impact. The ERA got it wrong. Because what John experienced wasn't just a loss of income, it was a loss of dignity, a loss of standing, and cultural harm that carried weight far beyond the workplace. Let's move into Vahanoa's experience. So when the Employment Court of New Zealand looked at Vahanoa, it recognized that she was experienced and also went far beyond just losing her job. Vahanoa, born and raised in Tonga, her culture deeply woven into who she is, her identity, she told the court that the way her employment was terminated felt culturally offensive, causing not just distress, but a real loss of mana. Before her dismissal, she held a senior leadership role and was respected both within the Pacific Business Trust and in her community. She carried it with pride, and in it represented for her and her family. But after losing her job, everything changed. As the primary income earner with 4 dependent children and a husband unable to work due to medical reasons, the financial pressure hit her immediately. She fell behind on rent and faced the risk of eviction. She defaulted on loans. Her vehicle was repossessed. She relied on food parcels and even turned to selling fish and taro leaves just to get by. But beyond the financial hardship, there was a deeper impact. She spoke about the shame, the humiliation, and the loss of dignity from being someone her family was proud of. She described herself as hitting rock bottom, withdrawing, staying at home, and struggling emotionally. The stress began to affect her health, causing migraines and other physical symptoms, and it created strain within her family. It was supported by those around her son, her pastor, social workers, all of whom confirmed that level of hardship she faced and the weight of the shame that she carried. When it came to compensation for emotional harm, the Employment Court of New Zealand made it clear that this wasn't just about dismissal, it was about the full experience. Both the unjustified dismissal and the unjustified disadvantage were deeply connected. So the court treated them together and took what's called a global approach to compensation. So to decide what's fair, the court had a look at other similar cases where employees had experienced shame, humiliation, and a loss of dignity. And in those cases, the common thread was it wasn't just the job loss that caused harm, it was how they were treated in that process. Feelings of embarrassment and deep personal shame were recognized by the court as serious harm. And in some cases, the harm was so significant that people felt unable to even re-enter the workforce. The court acknowledged that any dismissal can be distressing. Because the process was flawed, it was rushed, it lacked proper support, it failed to uphold the very Pacifica values that were meant to guide the organization, values that weren't just implied, but written into the employment agreements, So there was a reasonable expectation that those values would be honoured, and they weren't. The impact ran deeper. The court accepted that both plaintiffs, Vahanoa and John, experienced a high level of shame and humiliation, but it found that the impact on Vahanoa Vea was particularly severe. We'll be back right after this break.
Hey, have you signed up with BLUNET yet? No? Well, let's fix that.
Head over to www.blunet.co.nz and hit Join Us today. All you need to do is fill in your name, date of birth, phone number, and a few other details. This helps us get you set up faster. We'll also need a photo of your ONT serial number and your modem. Not sure what an ONT is? Don't worry, this is what it looks like, and every house with internet has one. And make sure you have a valid ID and a utility bill or government letter to confirm your address.
When you join BLUNET, you're not just getting fast, stable internet. You're also supporting shows like Tautuana, Breaking Waves, and Sports Salanoa. Your BLUNET subscription helps us bring you more content.
If you sign up this month, you get $10 off your first 3 months. If you have any questions, call 0800 258 638. Join BLUNET today.
Oi, kau.
Come with me. This is where our adventure begins. we call it home. This is Samoa.
Welcome back to our show. Crazy events that I have just relayed back to you guys about the treatment of John and Wahanoa, and just the amount of injustice and the opposite of Pacifica values and how they were treated in this process. But I want to show you guys what the court ruled, the outcome of this case. The authorities finding that the plaintiffs had not established their unjustified disadvantage claims is set aside. The grievances are established and a global approach to compensation is taken for the plaintiff's grievances for unjustified disadvantages and dismissals. The authorities' award of compensation for lost wages and benefits is set aside and the following orders are made. A sum equivalent to 6 months lost wages under Section 128 is awarded to Mr. Faitala, less any money the trust was ordered to pay by the authority and any other income he has earned during this period. A sum equivalent to 12 months lost wages under Section 128 is awarded to Ms. Vea, less an ex gratia payment of 4 weeks paid by the trust and 2 months lost wages the trust was ordered to pay by the authority. The authority's award of compensation under Section 123 is set aside and the following orders are made. A payment of $30,000 by way of compensation under Section 123 to Mr. Faitala, and a payment of $45,000 by way of compensation under Section 123 to Ms. Vea. The authority award of compensation for loss of benefits under Section 123 is set aside. The trust is ordered to pay the above sums to the plaintiffs within 21 days of the date of this judgment. Costs are reserved. If they cannot be agreed, I will receive memoranda with any submissions on behalf of the plaintiffs being filed and served within 28 days. So yes, John and Wahanoa, they came out winning, and the trust, clear example of claiming millions in Pacific money, but doesn't even know the bare minimum, the simplicity of Pacifica values. I have a special guest on my show, which I'm really excited to bring on. He's very involved in communities. Teleai Edwin Puni is the chairman of the Pacific Leadership Forum in New Zealand. The PLF consists of Pacific Island communities, members nationwide, represented through their respective elected leaders who have come together, united in their vision to progress a better future for Pacific people in New Zealand. To date, the PLF provides the most significant Pacific mandate and is the largest unified Pan-Pacific network in New Zealand. Teleai is a co-founder and current board member of the ASA Foundation Trust, an Auckland-based non-government organization that is well known for its charity work across Auckland, in the regions and the nationwide to build a thriving Pacific communities in New Zealand. Teleai has worked in governance and senior management level over 25 years, a respected Samoan and a Pacific community leader in New Zealand, well versed in central government and local government matters. Teleai is a businessman, an entrepreneur by profession, an experienced sports administrator, and a senior Samoan orator. He hails from the villages of Samatau, Whalatai, Matatufu, and Puapua in Samoa, and a proud father of two teenage daughters. Malolala soifua. Teleai, welcome to our show. How are you today?
Lovely to be a guest on your show, and looking forward to talk about some of these significant issues that we need to bring it to the attention of our people.
Absolutely. Before we go too serious, how are you? How was your week? How's everything been going?
Well, it's the school holidays, and when you have two teen daughters, which is the favorite part of that bio for me, is being a father, and so spend time with them. They're on a camp, so it's been quiet today, but the school holidays is always a busy time for parents.
What's the most exciting thing that you're working on right now?
A bit of everything, and I think that's when you are getting close to the 60s, you look back and say, what could I have done better? What should I do? I mean, Teleai is not going to be around forever. So, every day counts, in this kind of age and time of my life.
Perfect. I wanted to ask you some questions because I know you have a lot of experience in this space. You've done the work. When we say respect in a Pacifica context, what does that actually look like in practice inside an organization that is tax funded?
Well, it goes back to the starting point for me, and I think it's common across our Pacific organizations, whether it's businesses, NGOs, is that what makes us significant is our foundation and our values of our Christian values and our cultural values. And so one of the things that comes out in those two areas is both olalofa, maleva, that respect, and also being kind and being gracious. And these are some of the guiding principles that adds on to the normal Palangi way of doing things. Yep. So it's an added value, and these are things that makes us different. Unfortunately, I think some of these things are eroding from our practice here in Aotearoa.
Why do you think they are eroding?
Well, we've come to New Zealand in the 50s, so we've been here for a long time. And one of the things that I'm observing is that we are becoming disconnected from our Christian values and from our cultural values. And sometimes it's quite often that you can see and you can read, there's a lot of people talking about being Pacific, but very plastic. Plastic not only in the way they talk and speak on our behalf, that's not us, and you're not really speaking on our behalf, but also the values that you bring to leadership. And I think this is also important that we don't just point out what's wrong in communities, but let's also point out what's wrong with our leaders.
Conflict happens a lot in these Pacific spaces. What does it look like to apply Pacific values even in moments of conflict?
Conflicts is not a bad thing because it's part of life. It's a reality. What is missing is how we manage these conflicts. And sometimes either we go extreme and make it bad for everyone, or we should admit and be humble that we were wrong as leaders. We were wrong with the processes, and let's fix it. It can make both sides better. So I think this is the maturity that's missing with a lot of our leaders and a lot of things, that we are missing that humility, missing that respect, missing that love. But we are so righteous in our thinking that we can't say, I'm sorry.
From a Pacific economic kind of development perspective, what does it mean? What are the consequences, for agencies or institutions who use Pacific values but don't apply them?
It's a big loss. It's a big loss to us, particularly us living in New Zealand, because we are a minority, and we depend on the government, New Zealand, where we reside, some in Australia, America who are listening in, is that these government are guided by some strong voices. And so if some of these voices are not being honest in what's being relayed, then it makes all of us look bad, and so some of the losses I'm starting to see in regards to funding, government prioritizing Pacific in New Zealand, and also loss of some of the key areas that matter to us, it's partly our fault. It's partly our fault because we haven't been honest in the processes that we go about.
What are maybe your thoughts on how we could improve holding these institutions who receive millions of our tax funds accountable for not applying cultural values? I mean, not all of us can afford to go to court. It's very unfair for us, to take these things to court. But what are your kind of solutions around that?
Well, I've been around for quite some time in New Zealand, and I can reflect that one of the earliest government initiative for Pacific people is the Pacific Business Trust. I think it was 1985. 50 years. Are we better off? Big question. Yeah. It means that we haven't learned to better ourselves, to better our process, to better our people. Our Ministry for Pacific People came under the Department of Maori about 1990. That's what, 35 years? Yep. And again, are we better off? or we have been just riding and using it as a means to self-interest and serving limited groups and not serving the whole community. Radio 531 PI now, or PMN, came later, about 2000 something. Yep. So it's really important that the questions you are asking is, we got to look back and see it. Are our Pacific people better off? Or is it the best by day of this organization is up? We need to relook into a better setup that serves our people today. Maybe back then it was the right fit, maybe not today. So there are bigger questions. I think we're ready to have that conversation.
Well, the truth is that business per capita for Pacific people has remained at 1.9% for the last decade. So, it's so hard to actually get accountability from these kinds of institutions. Where do the politicians sit in this? Where do their roles come in regards to accountability?
That is also a very challenging area. We've had Pacific members of parliament, in the last 30 years, Again, we ask the question, are Pacific people better off? Is things getting better or getting harder for us? Because that is also a key avenue to make changes, is politicians. Or is it now becoming that you just go in because we vote you every year, but when you get in, you don't see us until 3 more months, then you start coming to churches, you start coming to Polyfest and others, and yet the whole term you are not coming out to say, how can we better the Pacific Business Trust? How can we better the radio station? All these government-funded agencies. And so there is a real issue that needs to be put out there. Are these entities serving us, or 50 years, 40, 30 years later, ain't making any positive real changes?
What are you, so obviously you've seen a lot of Pacific politicians claim the Pacific values, and then they only come around when they need us. What kind of talent or skills do we need in those areas to actually see improvements in these institutions?
Well, the best one is start from the top. And this is why it's important that we, as Pacific people, must be very strategic in our voting. It starts from members of parliament, even local government, local boards and stuff. Electing the right people will go a long way in making some real changes. So, I'm not saying that those who were in those roles in the past didn't do anything at all. I'm sure they served, but is it relevant? Is it enough? Or should we expect more from politicians, both central and local government? And I think with that, we can also make changes through our voices to go into some of these entities. How can we improve their processes and also focus on outcomes rather than ticking boxes?
My last question for you, Teleai, is what is your advice for any Pacific person working in an organization that is tax funded and has to abide by cultural values? What is your advice for people who hold that responsibility?
If this is where I go back, Hannah, to these entities were established because of the need of our Pacific people. It is not their business. It is not to serve them. It is not for them to gain, and I'm talking about those who work in these entities. They are supposed to be there to serve our communities. And if you work in any of these organizations and you see that they are not operating with transparency, accountability, and in particular, not Pacific-like, we need to reach out and say, it is time that these things need to be changed. And I think this conversation we're having today is a great start of opening up. Reach out to leaders, happy to talk with you. Reach out to other leaders and start making some real changes. I think if we don't do that, then we're just going to continue on for the next 50 years.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Would you like to share any last words?
Well, wishing our communities, the best for this year. As you can see, things are getting harder, and we can't just blame politicians. For 50 years or more, we haven't organized ourselves, and this is where the Pacific Leadership Forum has come through to organize ourselves, get more involved, get more connected with New Zealand, whether it's in government agencies, so that we know what's there to help our people. So I encourage our people to do more thinking and do more talking, like what we're doing today.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Tele Ai, for coming onto the show and sharing your perspective and your wealth of knowledge with our audience. We appreciate you so much, and we wish you all the best with all the work that you're doing in our community, and we'll definitely be having you on the show more across the year. Thank you, Tele Ai. But yeah, guys, honestly, leadership needs to be called into question, because when you look at what happened with the Pacific Business Trust, there's a technical failure in the process. It wasn't a technical failure, it was a failure in leadership. So we need to do better as a people, all of us collectively together. And thank you so much for joining our Breaking Waves episode. Thank you for tuning in. Please, our last wish is that you like, subscribe, and share our content. That would help us so much. And thank you for supporting us always. Aloha atu, Breaking Waves.
Hey, have you signed up with BLUNET yet? No? Well, let's fix that.
Head over to www.blunet.co.nz and hit Join Us today. All you need to do is fill in your name, date of birth, phone number, and a few other details. This helps us get you set up faster. We'll also need a photo of your ONT serial number and your modem. Not sure what an ONT is? Don't worry, this is what it looks like, and every house with internet has one. And make sure you have a valid ID and a utility bill or government letter to confirm your address.
When you join BLUNET, you're not just getting fast, stable internet. You're also supporting shows like Tautuana, Breaking Waves, and Sports Salanoa. Your BLUNET subscription helps us bring you more content.
If you sign up this month, you get $10 off your first 3 months. If you have any questions, call 0800 258 638. Join BLUNET today.
Oi, kau!
Come with me. This is where our adventure begins.
Le mafai o na namu Whaamalo si tu maupea O te alofa ia te oe la Samoa La Samoa La Samoa
You call it paradise, we call it home. This is Samoa.
La Samoa